You know, it's interesting because many of the books that I think have been on the top of the Amazon bestseller list in recent years about Israel have been sort of anguished books. Books about the conflict, books about the turmoil. You know, Ari Shavit's book, you know, Yossi Klein Halevi's book. There's much of this, how do we sort through this? But your book is very different in just the tone itself. And I think it's dimensional in a way that's very nice because it starts with an examination of poetry, which is not what you would often think about, right, in a historical text. So talk to, if you would, a little bit about poetry and art and how that fits into your kind of view of Israel.
Well, you're right that these other books, which are excellent actually, do come from a place of tremendous anguish and inner turmoil, largely because they're focused on the conflict. And the first thing that it seemed to me that had to be done in telling the story was to make the conflict not the spine of the narrative. In other words, the conflict is there, it's got to be addressed, it's got to be invoked, both in the ways in which Israel's, I think, handled it admirably, but also the ways in which Israel's handled it much less than admirably. But to make the conflict the spine of the story and to suggest that by knowing something about the conflict, one knows something or understands Israel, is analogous to saying something like, well, you don't know anything about America, but somebody asks you, tell me what America stands for. Let's imagine that they asked that back in an era in which we knew. And they said, and you said the answer was, well, there was a war in 1776, and there was a war in 1812, there was a civil war between 62 and 65, and a First World War and a second, I'll leave a bunch of them out, Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Those are all important events, and some of those wars were fought because of the values that America stands for. But you don't know anything about America if you know those wars. If you want to know America, you got to read the Federalist Papers. You got to read Thomas Jefferson's last public letter to his colleagues who had written the Declaration of Independence. You got to read the Declaration of Independence. You got to read Abraham Lincoln's Lyceum Address. You have to read Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail. And remember, by the way, that Martin Luther King was in jail not in China or in Korea, but he was in jail in the United States, and that letter we have now is that we have it because he wrote it in the margins of newspapers, ripped up the newspaper and handed the little pieces to his visitors because he wasn't allowed to write or smuggle things out either. In other words, really great republics and really extraordinary democracies have really shady parts of their story. So first thing that I wanted to do was not to fall into that 48, 56, 67, 73 milestone trap because it sets the wrong stage on which to build the story. So then the question becomes, what's the story about? What's the book really about? And the book that I wanted to write was a book which told not only what happened, but tried to give a sense of why it happened. What animated the people who out of the middle of nowhere decided, I mean, the most ridiculous thing in the world, to create a Jewish state if there hadn't been one for 2,000 years. What motivated people to move to swamp-ridden, parts of Israel where there was malaria and so forth, and to stick it out? And you had to get into the soul. And I think that the soul of the people who did this work, people who did the military work, the people who did the political work, the agricultural work, the soul actually comes out in Israel's writers, whether it's poets like Bialik or Chernyakhovsky or Alterman, or whether it's novelists like David Grossman and Amos Oz. And it was important to me to show kind of a wide range, both of left-wing and right-wing and religious and secular and so forth, but also to see how actually some of these poets and writers' positions actually shift over the course of their own careers, because the nature of the reality on the ground there is that what makes sense to you at one period won't necessarily make sense to you in a different period. And part of the challenge for all of us, I think, is to become less wedded to our own positions than to an open engagement with a changing reality. So I wanted it to be about the soul of the Jewish people, and I thought the poets and the writers were the place to start.